Hello everyone and welcome back to another unit. Today we are going to begin our look at World War II. I will tell you right now, this unit is going to appear much different from our previous units. You're going to get a lot more information than what you had before, and I picked this unit to do so because a lot of students come into this unit knowing a lot more about the topic and having a firmer foundation and base for what we're going to talk about. So, I kind of use that opportunity to mimic a little bit more as to what you will experience in different advanced level coursework, and especially for those who are looking to go into advanced junior and senior year with IB history. I am the IB history teacher for junior year. So this is mimicking exactly what we do in those courses, so kind of getting you used to that. If you have not watched my introductory video on how to take notes during this unit, you need to stop this video. You need to go back and watch that right now because it's going to be a lot different. There's not nearly as much information on the screen, and a lot more you're going to need to record straight from the information I give you. So we are going to go ahead and turn to it. These lectures are going to be a little bit longer. Again, they mimic more so what you would find in a college classroom. But again, I do find that students, the vast majority, tend to enjoy that a little bit more at the end of it. So, expect a little bit longer lectures, but we'll probably have a little less coursework during the course of this unit. So we'll go ahead and begin our look at World War II, and I do want to, just remind you exactly how devastating this war was. I think we so often we romanticize war in this country. It's a natural thing to do. There are many heroes that emerge from World War II, and we grow up sometimes hearing stories about the bravery, which should not be diminished. I'm not trying to take away from those stories at all, but ultimately, the reason we study wars is to try and figure out how to avoid the scenarios that led to those situations. This was a devastating, absolutely devastating war. 100 million people killed. It's the worst war the world's ever seen. And yes, there would be heroes that need to be remembered, but we also need to learn the lessons as to what led us to this horrible, horrible time period, and try to avoid those. And I think what you're going to see is radicalization, radical, selfish political desires, coupled with economic downturns, is what led us into this situation. I always like to begin, and here I'm talking about this romanticized view of it, and then trying to kind of do the same thing. Take a look at this picture. This is one of the images. World War II would be the first real war in which you have mainstream media alongside the soldiers taking pictures of combat, returning that. I mean, there would be updates on nightly news as to what was happening in the war. So Americans and global society is much more engaged in this. I said nightly news. Mainly radio at this point, sorry, not on television, but you would see images in magazines and newspapers, but just to clarify that point. But look at this image. This is a picture from the American forces landing on D-Day. We'll talk more about D-Day in depth, but many of these young men getting off this boat into waist-deep water, which was not the plan, by the way. Many of them, they're under fire in this picture, and many of them would not survive the day. I've never been in a scenario where I literally knew that the next few steps I took might be my last. I can't imagine how scared they must have been and how brave they were to continue on. So I'm thankful for the sacrifice of this generation that allowed us to have the freedoms that we enjoy, because the world would be a completely different place if these men and women had not dedicated their lives, and some of them sacrificing their lives in order to stop the onslaught of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it and begin taking our notes. So again, guys, I do have a brief outline here. I'm going to talk about each one of these points, and the details that I give you is what you need to focus on and write down. So you cannot talk about World War II without talking about World War I. It directly feeds into it. In fact, one of my favorite lines about this is one of the curators at the World War I Museum here in Kansas City. If you ever take a tour, he'll often say that he doesn't even refer to it as World War II. He refers to it as World War I Part B. And I think that's very fair, because the conflict that we left in 1918 is simmering. It's not gone away, and you'll notice that a lot of the same political lines are going to be drawn at the beginning of this next war. So the reasons for World War II are rooted right here in 1918, and in particular with the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in our World War I unit, we highlighted quite a bit as to why the Treaty of Versailles was such a failure and the problems that it did create. We're going to briefly take a look at those right here. First of all, beginning with new nations and land lost. So again, what I'm referring to there is that the Treaty of Versailles took the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, and frankly, a lot of Russia as well. Russia would lose more land than anyone. And it created some new nations out of those, many of which were centered around ethnic groups that had either dominated or historically had controlled that region, such as Poland. And it created these new nations from those former empires. The problem with this is that many of those countries that lost this land, they feel wronged. Okay, I mean, Germans feel wronged. They feel as if their government betrayed them at the end of World War I, and most mainstream Germans would like to see that land come back into German territory. And same with Russia. Remember, Russia fought on the winning side of this war, World War I, but yet they lost more land than anyone. So Russians, but again, that was mainly less due to the treaty itself and more so due to the peace treaty that they signed with Germany, giving away a lot of that land. So it is kind of somewhat their own fault. But the, excuse me, Germany and Russia in particular, or the Soviet Union, I should refer to them as the Soviet Union. I will often kind of use those, in the same way. Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR, it's all the same thing. It's like saying the U.S. or America or United States of America or USA. It's all the same thing, right? So if I refer to it as Russia or the Soviet Union, same nation. Germany and the Soviet Union want their land back, okay? And that will eventually lead to the outbreak of war in 1939 in Europe, of both these countries reaching a secret agreement to get that land back. Now, the League of Nations was also another failure of the Treaty of Versailles. It was a great idea. Remember, it was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, but ultimately it was a very weak organization that did not have the participation of the largest countries in the world, including the United States. How can you have an organization that is based off of global world peace and the participation of all countries when they don't all participate? It just doesn't make sense, and it wouldn't last. So the weakness of the Treaty of Versailles, coupled with the fact that there was no military way of backing these things up. The Treaty of Versailles could basically shake their fists at any country engaging in war or engaging in wrongdoing, but that was it. The Treaty of Versailles had no teeth to it. And so what we're going to see is that the treaty would, or excuse me, I keep saying Treaty of Versailles. We're focusing here on the League of Nations. I apologize, I kept saying treaty. But the League of Nations, that organization, it lacked teeth. And so, once Germany and Japan, as I like to say, kind of get frisky here and start invading other nations, the treaty, I did it again, the League of Nations will, again, kind of shake their fist at these two countries, and they quite literally get up and walk out the door. What do you do? I mean, there's nothing you can do. So, one of the biggest problems that you're going to see, and this will directly lead me to my third point, is that countries are so terrified of having another world war that they're unwilling to stand up to the bully the first time around. What I mean by that is every country had suffered tremendous losses in World War One, and no politician wants to go through that again, nor will their country support that. So, America is going to stay out of World War II for quite a while. Because I think a lot of it is fear of American boys dying on the beaches in Europe, and rightfully so. They had good reason to fear that. But the third point on here, pacifism, the rise in belief that war should be avoided at all costs. I am not a fan of war. I do not like war. I think most wars can be avoided. But often there comes a tipping point in which it cannot be avoided. And World War II reached that point. Nazi Germany was not going to stop just because you talk nice to them, okay? Nazi Germany had to be, like the bully that, comes along and steals your lunch money every day. If you shake their hand and say, hey, listen, I'll give it to you today, but don't do this tomorrow. What are they going to do? They're going to keep doing the exact same thing. The only thing that they're going to listen to is when you punch them in the mouth, right? And that's what Nazi Germany needed, because they are going to gobble up all of Europe, and most countries are left unwilling to do anything about it. So pacifism, this idea that war should be avoided at all costs, this frankly will mean that the war will last a lot longer because America will not get involved when it should. And again, we need to look at this from the lens of someone in this day and age. They didn't know how this was going to turn out. They didn't know what the right and wrong decisions were at this moment. Only we can say that based off of knowing what happens later on. We have that benefit. But again, the rise of pacifism, I always like to highlight the statistic that in the United States, it was in public polls, 70% of Americans had said that World War I had been a mistake, or at least America joining World War I had been a mistake. And again, we won the war, but yet 70% of Americans, you can't get 70% of Americans to agree on pizza toppings, okay, much less anything political. So, to have 70% of Americans say World War I, our participation had been a mistake, that shows you kind of the mindset of people in the 1920s and into the 30s. So we really had in the 20s returned to a policy of isolationism, and that's something that would continue through FDR's administration. I'll talk more about FDR later on because I think he saw the writing on the wall early and was frankly unwilling, or not unwilling, but unable to do anything because of the rise of pacifism in the U.S. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So the framework in which we're going to see this war emerge is in the midst of the Great Depression. And we just went through the unit on the Great Depression. We saw that how it affected the United States, but it was a global depression. This was something that was not just affecting the United States. This was something that was affecting people overall across the world. Overall, global trade decreased in this decade by 50%. Okay? Half of the goods not being shared and traded throughout the world. And what that means is, think of the incomes that are devastated, the jobs that are lost because of this lack of trade. This is going to have a tremendous effect. In some areas, unemployment will reach 33%. 1 out of every 3 people without a job. That's things are broken at that point. We're going to highlight each of the countries, a couple of the main countries that are going to be heavily involved in this war, and identify, what was happening to them in the Great Depression and how it led them directly into the war. The first is the United States, and we saw just recently, the effect the Great Depression had in the U.S. Employment at 25%. We saw that FDR was elected as kind of a I can't remember the phrase I'm looking for. People did not, they had judged Hoover as being a bad president for not doing anything. Referendum, there you go. FDR was selected kind of as a referendum on Hoover. His laissez-faire policies were not working, and so FDR, we tried to handle things internally. You're going to see all these different countries handle this economic depression in different ways. We are trying to handle it internally. Okay, tax dollars go up, government spending goes up, employment. We try to focus on government actually, building up employment. whether you agree with it or not, that was the tactic used by FDR. And, so throughout the 1930s, we're really focused on America and our own domestic policies. Not every country handled it as peacefully as we did. For instance, Spain. Spain will go through one of the worst crises of its entire history, and that is by devolving into a civil war. Spain had really been divided into two different forces. You had the Republicans on one side, and it has nothing to do with American political parties, okay? Just meaning those that support and would like a republic. I will tell you there were many groups within that Republican side for the Spanish Civil War. In fact, even communist forces supported the Republican side there. So many different groups kind of formed that half of the Spanish Civil War. But on the other side, you had a new political group rise up that were called the fascists. And I'm going to define exactly what fascism means later on, but you had the civil war between these two groups. The fascists were led by a general named Francisco Franco, and this war became quite brutal, and this became the first fighting in Europe since World War I. And what you saw is kind of like a mini version of World War II play out, because basically both sides had their supporters, right? Of course, the fascist side was fed by other fascist countries that we'll discuss. Italy, Germany, they're going to be sending tanks and planes to support the fascist side. On the Republican side, they didn't actually have as much support, even though many people would consider them closer aligned than with the fascists. But people were so afraid of getting involved in another war that we wouldn't even support those who we would very much benefit from winning this civil war. And so what that means is the fascists are getting all the help, and eventually they do win the Civil War. I will mention that even though governments will not take an official position and aid the Republican side in this Civil War, that did not mean that individuals could remain neutral or had to remain neutral. In fact, many Americans, there were thousands of Americans that actually volunteered to go over and fight in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republican Army. In fact, the famous Americans that did that formed a group called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and that is a term that I would like you to know. The American volunteers that fought in the Spanish Civil War, the American Lincoln Brigade. As I mentioned, eventually the fascists would win the Civil War in Spain. Franco would last as dictator of that country for the next 36 years. That would have long-lasting effects well into the 70s that we would see a fascist government in Spain. Moving on, let's talk about what's happening in another major country that we're going to discuss, and that is the Soviet Union. Now, we've discussed the Soviet Union a couple times. Remember that they have gone through a communist revolution in their country where they kicked out the Tsar, killed the entire Tsar family, the royal family, and a communist government was successfully installed there in the 1920s. Fast forward to this period, 1930s, and the current leader of the Soviet Union is a man named Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin, and by the way, time out, I do want you to know the leaders of these countries. It's very important you know who the leaders are because I'm going to be discussing them quite a bit. So we've already mentioned a couple here, FDR for America, Franco for Spain, and then Joseph Stalin for the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin was a ruthless individual, and we're of course going to talk quite heavily about Adolf Hitler in this unit, talk about the tens of millions of, 11 million people killed in the Holocaust alone, much less, tens of millions more killed by the war that he begins in Europe. Believe it or not, though, Adolf Hitler kind of takes a back seat to the number of people that Joseph Stalin killed. We hardly talk about this in comparison, but Joseph Stalin was extremely ruthless, and The difference is that Stalin focused more on killing his own people than invading others and killing them. Stalin would be responsible for tens of millions of deaths. And again, mainly people in his own country that he saw as political enemies, rooting out. In fact, in the 20s, they would go through a period called the Great Purge, in which Stalin tried to root out political enemies, whether they were or not. It was a show of force, a show of violence that in Russia, I mean, at the height of the Great Purge, Stalin was killing 1,000 people in the street a day that were so-called enemies of the state. So, you know, Stalin extremely ruthless. And perhaps the reason we don't remember him as such is because ultimately he's going to be an ally of ours. And that might be kind of a tough pill to swallow. But this is truly one of the cases of the enemy of your enemy is our friend. Okay, I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase or not. But in this case, the bigger threat than Stalin's communism is Hitler's Nazism. And so we actually align with this evil man, Stalin, to put down what we saw as a bigger threat at the time in Adolf Hitler. I will say that kind of sets up the next conflict. We're a few short years here away from the Cold War, and that will be between the U.S. and the Soviet Union after we put down the Nazi Empire. Now, again, back to kind of the notes here, you know, what Joseph Stalin in particular was doing to combat the Great Depression in Russia. They also turned inward. They looked at maximizing production. And, you know, Russia has always been a somewhat backward country. They've always kind of been, I mean, goodness, they had feudalism until the 1900s. I mean, literally like serfs that you studied like in middle school, you know, the Middle Ages. So Russia's always kind of been backwards when it comes to, you know, keeping up with current trends. And by the 1930s, Stalin realized that Russia had really fallen behind in terms of production, in particular, steel production and industrialization. So one of the ways that they focus on combating the Great Depression in the Soviet Union is by maximizing steel production and just overall industrialization in general. Stalin called this his 5-year plan, and the idea was to, you know, try to raise the amount of production levels over a period of 5 years, and it was tremendously successful. They did not only raise the levels of steel production in general from 4 million tons to 18 million tons over that 5-year period. It was so successful that they actually followed it up with another 5-year plan. Not very creative on the names, but it worked. And I will kind of a quick time out on this. And as a reminder, guys, we're talking about a communist society, and you know, there are many and perhaps mostly negative things that we need to remind ourselves are a part of this, because the way that they focus on maximizing the steel production is by, frankly, ignoring many other areas, including things like agriculture. As a result of these 5-year plans, many people are going to end up starving to death in the Soviet Union because the focus has turned entirely to steel production. Can't eat steel, so many Russians sadly figured that out. But it's a brutal system. It's a very brutal system of government. So, you know, communism is something that, in terms of, I guess, efficiency in one area, I guess, you know, yeah, sure, they increase production, but you got to look at the hundreds of other categories that took a downturn because of this nationwide focus on steel production. And beyond that, I mean, we're not even touching the human rights abuses, the lack of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Those are non-existent in a communist society. You cannot be you are not an individual in a communist society. No private property. But hey, you got steel. All right, moving on. Let's talk about what's happening in Asia. And, you know, I do want to focus pretty heavily on Asia because this is where World War II begins. The fighting begins in 1931 with the rise of Japan and their invasion of Manchuria, China. Before I get into that, though, I want to kind of fashion this idea of what Japan had become. We briefly mentioned Japan back in our World War I unit, and we don't go too in depth, but I believe I made the mention, or at least I should have, that Japan by this point, by World War I, 1914, okay, Japan is really attempting to follow the blueprint that Europeans have laid out on how to become a great power, right? And how do you do that? Well, you have a strong military, okay, check, they do. You have an empire, okay, and Japan is attempting to build that empire with their involvement in World War I. In fact, they will go attack German colonies in Asia, in the Pacific, and how are they rewarded at the end of all their efforts? Because remember, Japan in World War I fights on our side. They are a part of the Entente. They are allied with the United States and France and Britain. But yet, how are they treated at the end of World War I? They are not treated as an equal. In fact, they are not even invited to the Treaty of Versailles. They take that personally, and they feel disrespected, that they would literally dedicate millions of dollars and thousands of Japanese lives to this cause, and they want to be seen as equals. They are not, and they're treated extremely poorly. And this is a major, major milestone and turning point in the history of Japan because, frankly, the political leadership there in Japan they understand after World War I that Europeans and Americans will never see Japan on equal footing. And frankly, race is a big part of this, okay? We are dealing with an extremely racist time period, and most of those Western societies look upon Japan as lesser of a people, both in terms of civilization, but also soldiering and whatnot. So Japan makes a decision after World War I to go at it alone and to do it on their own. And so what we're going to see here in the 1930s is that this is their attempt to follow kind of the blueprint, that European Western blueprint, but without the Europeans in the West. They're just going to try to make an empire on their own. And for a short while, they're successful. But the government that had formed in Japan over the last 20 years is an extremely militaristic government. Everything that this government is focused on is building up the military, having a stronger army and navy, and eventually air force. But it's an extremely rigid militaristic society that students, when you go to school, you study military manuals. Every little boy in Japan, they are geared from the day they are born to become a military man, and everything is focused on building up. It was a symbol. The military was a symbol of Japan's strength, and it played a much bigger role in its politics than what we see here in America. So that's very important to know. There are two individuals that I need you to know as leaders of Japan, and they're both going to be equally important in our conversation. The first is the emperor, okay, Emperor Hirohito. And by the way, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of names that might be kind of hard to spell. On your outline that I have provided you in the supply pickup, but I have also posted into Schoology, I have in your outline listed all of these names, written them out, so that way you can refer to that while we take notes. So I would highly suggest you have your outline out as we go through, because there are additional terms on there that are not on the PowerPoint. But Emperor Hirohito is the first leader of Japan you need to know. As the name implies, he was the top dog in the empire. The Japanese have kind of an archaic belief system in which many Japanese saw the emperor as, frankly, a god in some ways, a deity, as at least someone closer to the gods than us mere mortals. And so Hirohito will be seen by many Japanese as either an incarnation of God, or at least someone that they should be willing to give their life to defend. And so when Hirohito tells them to fight, they fight, and sometimes and often to the death. The second leader of Japan you need to know is a man named Hideki Tojo. Now, Tojo will be the main general. He's the prime minister of Japan, and he will be the kind of main political leader. Hirohito is the overall leader, but the day-to-day government activities that are being pushed are done by Tojo. Okay, Tojo will be the main kind of military commander leading the movement of Japanese forces in the 1930s into the 40s. And so he's a very important name to know here. So now you understand kind of the leadership, kind of how it's set up, the society itself. You have to understand how militaristic and nationalistic it is. I mentioned how the Japanese had kind of been bared the brunt of kind of the Western racist view towards them. Believe it or not, they have the exact same racist view towards other Asian nations at the time. They see the Japanese and the Koreans as racially inferior to themselves. That plays a lot into our dialogue, and in fact, I'm about to talk about one of the most brutal events in world history, and a lot of that was based off of racial elements. So I'll get to that here in a second. Now, we need to turn our attention to China really quick, because in the 1920s, China will devolve into a civil war, and the civil war is between the nationalist government and a new rebel communist government that's trying to form, led by a man named Mao Zedong. Now, this Chinese Civil War is going to be brutal, but the reason I mention it here is because when China begins fighting amongst themselves, Japan sees their opportunity, and in fact, that is when they are going to invade. In 1931, in northern China, in this region, you can see on the map named Manchuria. It is north of Korea. Korea has been colonized by the Japanese at this point. They already have a foothold in Asia, but they are going to turn their sights towards that region known as Manchuria. And basically what ends up happening is in 1931, there's an attack on a Japanese company in China. Some railroad buildings and ties are destroyed. They're bombed. The Japanese are infuriated, and they demand retribution. They demand justice, and they basically use this Mukden experience, this Mukden incident. They use it as reasoning to invade China. So next thing you know, thousands of Japanese soldiers are in the mainland of China, and they have begun the invasion of China. Now, that's the short version of the story. Now, what we know today is that the Japanese actually set the entire event up themselves. The Mukden incident was entirely staged by the Japanese. There were attacks on Japanese property in China, but those attacks were all staged by the Japanese themselves. They needed a reason, a pretext to invade China, and they found that by saying that they were only defending their own property. So I'm telling you this not only to understand the reason that they invade China, but we're going to see this exact same tactic used by the Nazis. So it's very important to understand that a lot of this war is actually brought on by the aggressors themselves. Now, the full invasion of Manchuria, this would be where the war truly began, 1931. This is highly condemned by the international community. Ultimately, this will result in Japan withdrawing from the League of Nations, but ultimately, nothing comes of it in terms of repercussions for the Japanese. This invasion of Manchuria would continue, and they will work their way into the mainland of China with devastating costs to the Chinese, mainly due to the leadership of China, because Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of China at the time. He is so afraid of the communist threat from Mao Zedong that Chiang Kai-shek will refuse to actually fight the Japanese who have invaded in the north. In fact, it even results in what becomes known as the Xi'an incident, where there were a group of Chinese generals who actually kidnapped the president of China to basically force him and held him hostage until he agreed to go fight the Japanese. don't worry about the communists right now. Japan has invaded our country. I mean, you can just imagine this conversation going on. And ultimately, he did agree. There was a ceasefire to the Civil War when China agreed to turn their attention towards Manchuria and the invading Japanese. Ultimately, the war would not go well for the Chinese. It would be brutal. The Japanese would make their way all the way down to the capital, Nanking, and frankly, one of the most brutal incidents in world history that I can think of, and that is an event that became known as the Rape of Nanking, 1937, so a little bit later in the war. When the Japanese arrived at this major city in China, they are bloodthirsty. They are tired of this war. They have convinced themselves that the Chinese are the cause of this war. And when they get to one of the most populated cities in China, they get revenge. It is devastating, and I don't even want to go into some of the detail of pictures I've seen from this, but to give you one example of the brutality, there's a famous story about two Japanese generals who are arguing as to who was the better swordsman, and so they decided to hold a contest, and they lined up about 100 Chinese civilians in the street, and the two men started on opposite sides of this line, and they began to behead each of these Chinese civilians with a sword to see who could kill the most people the fastest. The brutality of the Japanese in this war is it's hard to match, and I say that even understanding the context of the Holocaust. The Japanese are going to be brutal, and I'll share some stories later on, even from what my grandfather witnessed when he was in the Navy as a young man, when they would take on some Japanese prisoners of war. The rape of Nanking resulted in 300,000 Chinese, many of which were raped, but also killed. Almost over 500,000 killed in this one city alone. The numbers of those that will be killed by this war are going to be astounding, and I hope you understand the level of violence and start to recognize why I suggested we have to avoid another similar situation at all costs. We will leave it at that for lecture number 1. So we're seeing the war develop. We've seen fighting already emerge in Asia. The rest of the world is on edge. Europe and Western society is frankly dealing with the greatest economic threat we've ever seen. And next time we return in lecture number 2, we're going to take a look at the rise of this new political, radical, brand new government. No one's ever seen this before, but a brand new government called fascism. All right, guys, thanks for paying attention, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks.